The search dogs found Phineas Webb's backpack first, torn fabric clinging to briars like prayer flags in a devil's church. Inside Hollingsworth Hollow, where morning mist never quite burns off and the creek runs rust-colored even after rain, Deputy Cyrus Marshall knelt beside what remained of a campsite that told a story no one wanted to read. This isn't just another missing hiker case. It's the key to understanding why 23 people have vanished without explanation in the same 10-mile radius of Appalachian wilderness over the past 30 years. The date was October 15, 1997, and Marshall had been tracking Webb for 4 days through terrain that seemed to swallow footprints whole. Webb, a seasoned outdoorsman from Richmond, had registered his hiking plan with Park Services before entering the Daniel Boone National Forest. His route would take him through Hollingsworth Hollow, a depression between two ridges that locals avoided with a kind of superstition usually reserved for graveyards and abandoned houses. Marshall's flashlight beam caught something glinting beneath a pile of wet leaves, a compass, its needle spinning wildly, unable to find true north. Beside it, Webb's journal lay open to an entry dated 3 days earlier. Strange smoke coming from the ridge. Voices carrying on the wind, but can't make out words. Almost sounds like singing. The creek here ran differently than elsewhere in the forest. Instead of the clear mountain water that bubbled over granite stones throughout the region, this stream moved thick and dark, like coffee left too long on a burner. The smell wasn't right either. Not the clean scent of pine and loam that hikers expected, but something meaty and rich that made Marshall's stomach turn. Local folklore painted Hollingsworth Hollow as cursed ground. Cherokee oral histories, passed down through generations before European settlement, spoke of a place where the earth itself was hungry. Early settlers reported strange disappearances, always travelers passing through, never locals who knew better than to linger after sunset. But Marshall dealt in facts, not ghost stories. The first concrete evidence came from a game camera mounted on an oak tree 20 yards from Webb's abandoned campsite. The footage, time-stamped at 2:37 a.m. on October 13th, showed Webb emerging from his tent, walking with the mechanical gait of someone sleepwalking or drugged. He moved toward the ridgeline, following what appeared to be a narrow trail that Marshall couldn't locate in daylight. The camera captured something else, shapes moving parallel to Webb's path, keeping pace, but staying just outside the frame's edge. Human figures, or close enough to human that the difference didn't matter in the grainy infrared footage. Webb's trail ended at a natural stone arch that formed a gateway between two sections of the hollow. Beyond the arch, the forest changed. Trees grew differently here, their trunks twisted and their branches reaching inward like arthritic fingers. The underbrush was sparse, as if nothing wanted to take root in this soil. They never found Webb's body. Marshall's investigation revealed a pattern that had escaped notice because it unfolded so slowly and spread across decades. Missing persons reports filed with different agencies, different jurisdictions, all describing experienced hikers, hunters, and campers who simply vanished while passing through this specific area. The disappearances clustered around certain times of year, late fall, when hunting season brought outsiders deep into the mountains, and early spring, when the hiking trails reopened after winter. The hunger never sleeps. What Marshall discovered next would force him to confront the possibility that some Appalachian families had found ways to survive in these mountains that civilization preferred not to acknowledge. Because Webb's journal contained one final entry, written in handwriting that forensic analysts confirmed wasn't his. "They've been so kind to take me in. The meat here tastes like nothing I've ever had." But who were they, and why did every investigation into the Hollingsworth Hollow disappearances eventually go cold, filed away and forgotten, like prayers whispered into an empty church? The answer lay with a family that had lived in these mountains since before the hollow had a name. A family that understood hunger in ways that would make your skin crawl if you knew what they'd learned to satisfy it. Hey everyone, before we go deeper into this investigation, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. And if this case is already giving you chills, smash that like button and subscribe, because what we uncover next is going to make Webb's disappearance look like a warm-up. The scream echoed through Hollingsworth Hollow at exactly 11:43 p.m. on March 22, 1867. Recorded in the Journal of Union Army Deserter, Josiah Stanhope, as the sound of a man discovering hell has teeth. What Stanhope couldn't have known was that he'd stumbled onto land that had been feeding the same family for generations, and that his own name would soon be carved into a very different kind of family tree. Understanding the Sinclair family means understanding how isolation can twist human nature into something that defies every moral boundary civilization has built. The hollow's acoustic properties amplified sound in strange ways, whispers carried for miles, while screams seemed to die within yards of their source. Local Cherokee had named this place Where the Earth Eats, avoiding it except for specific rituals that required the kind of silence only the dead could provide. When European settlers first mapped the region in 1792, surveyor Granville Sutherland noted in his field reports, "The natives speak of this valley with such fear that our guides refused payment rather than enter." The Sinclair family had different ideas about fear. Irving Sinclair arrived in these mountains sometime around 1820, though no official records document his passage. What survived were stories passed down through oral tradition, tales of a man who could track anything, who knew which plants would paralyze without killing, and who understood that the deepest hollers held secrets worth more than gold to those willing to pay the price. Irving's wife, Florence, brought skills of her own to their mountain homestead. Local midwives whispered that she could birth a baby or prepare a body for burial with equal expertise, and that the line between those two services had grown uncomfortably thin in her capable hands. Together, they established a homestead that lasted long after other settlers fled to easier ground. By 1850, 3 generations of Sinclairs had perfected survival techniques that neighboring families couldn't or wouldn't understand. While other mountain families struggled through harsh winters, the Sinclairs always had meat. While others lost children to disease and starvation, Sinclair children grew strong and numerous. The price of this prosperity remained unspoken, but the evidence hung in their smokehouse like a family secret too terrible to share. Stanhope's journal, discovered in 1923 during a geological survey, provided the first documented account of Sinclair hospitality. "They welcomed me with such kindness that I wept from gratitude." The daughter, no more than 16, prepared a feast the likes of which I hadn't tasted since before the war. "The meat was tender as a mother's love, seasoned with herbs that made my tongue sing. The feast turned bitter." His final entry, dated 5 days later, showed handwriting that deteriorated from neat script to desperate scratches. "Cannot leave. They say the trails are dangerous, that strangers have been attacked by wild animals, but I've seen no animals here, only the family, watching from their porch, counting each day I remain. The meat tastes different now, familiar." Archaeological evidence suggests the Sinclair homestead operated as a way station for travelers crossing the mountains. A logical setup, isolated families often provided lodging and supplies to passing strangers in exchange for news from the outside world and hard currency. But the Sinclair's guest registry, carved into an oak beam that survives today, tells a different story. Names appear, marked with arrival dates, but no departure dates. Ever. They fed what wandered close. The pattern persisted across generations. During the Civil War, deserters from both armies disappeared into Hollingsworth Hollow. During Prohibition, revenuers and federal agents vanished while tracking moonshine operations. In the 1930s, civilian Conservation Corps workers building mountain trails simply stopped reporting for duty. Each disappearance stood alone, unconnected to the others by anything except geography and the gnawing certainty that something in these mountains had learned to see travelers not as people, but as provisions. Local law enforcement learned not to investigate too closely. Mountain families protected their own, and the Sinclairs had been mountain people longer than anyone could remember. Sheriff Merrick Underwood's 1942 report summarized the department's official position. Hollingsworth Hollow remains outside practical jurisdiction due to terrain difficulties and lack of cooperative witnesses. What Underwood didn't mention was the jar of preserved meat that appeared on his desk after each missing person report, accompanied by handwritten notes suggesting he focus his attention elsewhere. The meat was always perfectly prepared, seasoned with mountain herbs that masked other flavors. Underwood never asked what animal it came from, but he stopped assigning deputies to Hollow investigations. The family adapted to changing times while preserving core traditions. They learned which government agencies to avoid and which could be influenced through carefully chosen gifts. They understood that modern communication meant travelers would be missed more quickly, so they became more selective, more patient. Quality over quantity became their guiding principle. But adaptation has limits, and by 1997, when Deputy Marshall began investigating Webb's disappearance, the Sinclairs faced a crisis that would force them to choose between survival and secrecy. How do you feed a hunger that's been growing for generations when the whole world is suddenly watching? Lucius Carrington's pickup truck sat idling in the pre-dawn darkness of November 3, 1997. Its headlights cutting through fog so thick it seemed solid enough to carve. The retired steelworker from Pittsburgh had driven 8 hours to hunt these mountains, drawn by stories of trophy bucks that lived in the deepest hollers where few hunters bothered to venture. What Carrington didn't understand was that in Hollingsworth Hollow, the line between hunter and prey shifted with the morning mist, and the Sinclair family had been perfecting their own hunting techniques for generations. The sound of metal scraping stone echoed from the ridge above Carrington's campsite, followed by the smell of wood smoke laced with something that made his hunting dogs whimper and retreat to their kennels. The texture of the air itself felt wrong, too thick, too warm for November, as if the hollow trapped heat the way it trapped sound. These sensory warnings should have sent Carrington back to his truck, but mountain hospitality has a way of making visitors ignore their instincts. Susan Spencer Sinclair emerged from the tree line at exactly 7:45 a.m., carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the kind of welcoming smile that made strangers feel like family. At 63, she represented the fourth generation of Sinclairs to call Hollingsworth Hollow home, and she'd learned from her grandmother Florence that the secret to sustainable hunting was patience, preparation, and perfect timing. "You picked a fine spot for camping," she told Carrington, gesturing toward his tent pitched beside the creek. "My family's lived up on the ridge for near 70 years. We don't get many visitors brave enough to venture this deep into the hollow." The Sinclairs had adapted their methods for the modern era, where previous generations could rely on truly isolated victims, deserters, drifters, people who wouldn't be missed for months or years. The 1990s brought cell phones, GPS devices, and families who expected regular contact from their traveling relatives. Susan understood that every visitor now came with digital breadcrumbs that led back to the outside world. So the family evolved. Instead of simply taking travelers who wandered into their territory, they began cultivating relationships. Susan would encounter hunters and hikers at the natural choke points where trails converged, offering local knowledge, weather warnings, and invitations to stop by the family homestead for a hot meal and dry shelter. Most visitors politely declined and continued on their way. But some accepted, drawn by Susan's genuine warmth and the promise of authentic mountain hospitality. Carrington was exactly the type of visitor the Sinclairs preferred, a retired widower with grown children who lived across the country, someone whose week-long hunting trips represented the highlight of his increasingly isolated existence. He'd driven alone, told his neighbors he might be gone up to 10 days, and brought enough supplies to stay completely off-grid. The deer move differently in this hollow, Susan explained as she poured Carrington coffee that steamed despite the chilly morning air. Something about the way sound carries makes them skittish. But my son Cyrus knows every game trail between here and the Tennessee border. He could show you places where the big bucks bed down, spots most hunters never find. The coffee tasted like mountain herbs and something darker, earthier. Carrington felt warmth spreading through his chest as Susan described her family's deep knowledge of the local wildlife patterns. She spoke with the authority that only comes from generations of intimate connection to a specific piece of land. Course, hunting season brings all kinds of folks into these mountains, Susan continued, her tone shifting slightly. Some know what they're doing, some don't. Last week, we found a fellow from Ohio who'd gotten himself turned around near the old Cherokee Trail. Been wandering for 3 days, half-starved, and talking nonsense about voices in the woods. Federal Bureau of Investigation case file, X97, HQ, 1,158,432, classified until 2012, contain details about 17 missing hunters reported in a 6-county area surrounding Hollingsworth Hollow between 1990 and 1997. The FBI investigation, led by Special Agent Nellie Hathaway, identified patterns that local law enforcement had either missed or chosen to ignore. Hathaway's analysis revealed that missing hunters shared specific characteristics. They were typically middle-aged men hunting alone. They possessed above-average outdoor skills, and they had chosen remote locations specifically to avoid contact with other hunters. In other words, they were perfect victims for predators who understood that isolation worked both ways. The hunger finds new ways. But Hathaway's investigation stalled when she attempted to interview local residents. Mountain communities protected their secrets with the same fierce loyalty they showed their families. And outsiders, asking too many questions, often found themselves politely but firmly encouraged to take their business elsewhere. When Hathaway requested permission to search properties in Hollingsworth Hollow, she was told that budget constraints and jurisdictional issues made such operations impractical. Carrington accepted Susan's invitation to visit the family homestead that evening, drawn by her descriptions of venison stew prepared according to recipes passed down through 4 generations. He broke camp at sunset, following Susan's directions, up a trail that seemed to exist only when you knew exactly where to look. The Sinclair homestead occupied a natural shelf carved into the mountainside, hidden from view until visitors climbed the final switchback. Solar panels and a satellite dish marked concessions to modernity, but the core structures, log cabin, smokehouse, root cellar, remained unchanged since Irving Sinclair first claimed this land. What Carrington couldn't see from the main cabin were the modifications hidden in the hollow below, motion sensors that detected approaching vehicles hours before they reached the homestead, radio equipment that monitored law enforcement frequencies, and storage facilities that could preserve meat through the warmest summers and longest winters. The Sinclairs had learned that modern survival required modern tools, but their fundamental purpose remained as ancient as hunger itself. How many missing hunters would it take before someone connected the disappearances to the family that had been feeding in these mountains longer than anyone alive could remember? The scream that never came echoed louder than any sound Lucius Carrington might have made, its absence hanging in the November air like smoke from a fire that burned too clean. By 9:15 p.m. on November 3rd, 1997, his hunting dogs had stopped howling and begun that low, constant whine that animals make when they smell death approaching on familiar footsteps. This wasn't just about one missing hunter. It was about understanding how a family could perfect the art of making people disappear while their neighbors looked the other way, choosing willful blindness over uncomfortable truths. The Sinclair dinner table that night bore witness to conversations that revealed how deeply the family's survival methods had evolved beyond simple predation into something approaching ritual. Susan's son Cyrus, 38 years old, and built like the logging equipment he operated in his cover job, carved portions with the methodical precision of someone who understood anatomy better than most butchers. His wife, Flora Cromwell Sinclair, had learned her grandmother's preservation techniques so well that meat could last through the harshest mountain winters without losing flavor or tenderness. Carrington was asking good questions about the game trails, Cyrus reported as the family gathered around their rough-hewn table. Knew enough about tracking to be dangerous if he'd stayed much longer. Plus, his truck's got one of those GPS things that records where he's been. Modern technology posed challenges that previous generations of Sinclairs never faced. Cell phone towers meant that missing persons could be triangulated to specific locations. Digital cameras created permanent records. Social media meant that people shared their travel plans with hundreds of friends and strangers. The family had adapted by becoming more sophisticated in their methods of concealment and misdirection. The Sinclairs operated with military-level planning and patience. They studied their targets for days or weeks before making contact, learning schedules, relationships, and communication patterns. They understood which hunters told people where they were going and which preferred to disappear into the mountains without detailed itineraries. They knew how to recognize the difference between someone who would be missed immediately and someone who had chosen isolation as a lifestyle. Flora's contribution to the family operation involved more than cooking. Her background as a licensed practical nurse, acquired through correspondence courses in the 1980s, gave her knowledge of anatomy, pharmacology, and the human body's vulnerabilities. She could render someone unconscious without leaving obvious evidence, ensure that final moments passed without struggle or noise, and process remains in ways that maximized yield while minimizing waste. The trick, Flora explained to her teenage daughter Philomena, is making them comfortable first. People taste different when they're scared. Fear makes the meat tough, bitter, but contentment, gratitude, that makes everything tender. The family's success depended on maintaining perfect camouflage within their community. They participated in church functions, helped neighbors during emergencies, and contributed to local charities. Cyrus served as a volunteer firefighter and had received commendations for his service during forest fire seasons. Susan taught Sunday school at the Baptist church in the valley below Hollingsworth Hollow. To outside observers, they represented the best qualities of mountain people: self-reliant, generous, and deeply connected to their land. This facade required constant maintenance and careful performance. Every interaction with outsiders was calculated to reinforce the image of a normal, if somewhat isolated, mountain family. They hosted an annual barbecue for their neighbors, using conventionally sourced meat and recipes that wouldn't raise questions. They maintained friendly relationships with local law enforcement, always willing to help with search and rescue operations for missing hikers. The barbecue served another purpose beyond community relations. It allowed the Sinclairs to observe how their neighbors reacted to different flavors and preparations, testing the boundaries of what people would accept without question. They learned which seasonings masked unusual tastes and which cooking methods produced the most familiar textures. Deputy Marshal's investigation had brought unwelcome attention to their activities, but the family viewed this as a temporary inconvenience rather than an existential threat. They'd weathered official scrutiny before. During the 1970s, a state police investigation into missing persons had come close to discovering their operation, but strategic contributions to local political campaigns and carefully timed character references from prominent community members had deflected serious examination. Some truths hide in plain sight. The Sinclairs understood that people saw what they expected to see. Investigators looking for evidence of foul play expected to find signs of violence, struggle, concealment, But the family's methods left no such evidence, because their victims came willingly, died peacefully, and were processed with reverence rather than brutality. From the outside, their operation looked like hospitality, not predation. Philomena Wright, a recent college graduate working as a freelance journalist, had begun researching Appalachian folklore for a magazine article about vanishing mountain traditions. Her interviews with elderly residents in the counties surrounding Hollingsworth Hollow revealed stories that painted the Sinclairs as exemplars of old-fashioned mountain values. Salt of the earth people, one retired teacher told her. They'd give you the shirt off their back. But Wright's research also uncovered patterns that mainstream media coverage had missed. Her analysis of missing persons reports spanning 5 decades revealed statistical anomalies centered on the hollow. While surrounding areas showed random distributions of disappearances consistent with accidents, animal attacks, and getting lost in wilderness areas, Hollingsworth Hollow showed clusters that suggested systematic rather than random causes. Wright's investigation would force the Sinclairs to make their most difficult decision yet, whether to maintain their traditional methods or adapt once again to survive in a world where information traveled faster than mountain fog and secrets became harder to keep with each passing year. What happens when a family that has fed on isolation suddenly finds themselves under the microscope of modern investigative journalism? Philomena Wright's laptop screen glowed at 2:47 a.m. on December 1st, 1997, casting blue light across newspaper clippings, topographical maps, and photographs that told a story no editor would believe without proof that could disappear as quickly as morning frost. The sound of her fingers typing echoed through her Charleston apartment like Morse code messages sent to an audience that might not want to receive them, while the smell of cold coffee mixed with the musty scent of old paper and the rough texture of anxiety that made her hands shake slightly as she compiled evidence. Wright's investigation threatened to expose a survival system that had operated successfully for over a century, protected by geographic isolation and a community conspiracy of silence that ran deeper than family loyalty. Her breakthrough came from an unexpected source: insurance records. While missing persons reports could be dismissed as coincidence or filed away as unsolved cases, insurance companies tracked patterns with mathematical precision. Wright's analysis of life insurance payouts in the 6-county region surrounding Hollingsworth Hollow revealed that beneficiaries waited an average of 7 years to declare missing persons legally dead, exactly the statutory PRODAX requirement. But the timing of these declarations showed suspicious clustering around specific dates and locations. Mountain families understand patience differently than city people, Wright noted in her research journal. But 7 years is a long time to wait for closure unless you already know that closure isn't coming. The insurance data led Wright to cemetery records, which revealed another pattern. Mountain communities typically buried their dead in family plots or small church graveyards, with detailed records maintained by local historians and genealogical societies. But Hollingsworth Hollow contained graves for people who had died in the hollow without any record of how they'd lived there. Strangers' names appeared on headstones, with birth dates, but no personal histories, as if their lives had begun only when they arrived in the mountains. Wright contacted surviving family members of the missing, presenting herself as a researcher studying Appalachian migration patterns. The conversations revealed details that never appeared in official reports. Missing persons had often mentioned meeting helpful local families who offered assistance with navigation, weather advice, or emergency shelter. Several had specifically described encounters with a woman who seemed to know every trail and game path in the region. Susan Spencer Sinclair's name appeared in Wright's notes with increasing frequency. The Sinclairs monitored their reputation with the same careful attention they paid to weather patterns and hunting seasons. Mountain communities operated on networks of information that moved faster than any official communication system. When strangers asked questions about local families, Word reached the subjects of inquiry within hours. Lenora Hollingsworth, whose great-grandfather had given his name to the Hollow, served as an unofficial intelligence gatherer for families who preferred privacy. Her position as postmaster in the valley town of Cedar Ridge gave her access to mail patterns, shipping records, and conversations that revealed who was asking what questions about whom. When Wright's interview requests began circulating through the community, Hollingsworth recognized a potential threat. The old ways demanded protection. That newspaper girl from Charleston's been calling around about the Sinclairs. Hollingsworth mentioned to Susan during their weekly grocery run on December 3rd. Says she's writing about mountain traditions, but her questions don't sound like folklore research. The Sinclairs had faced journalistic attention before, but Wright represented a new type of threat. Previous reporters had focused on human interest stories about mountain life, treating disappearances as tragic accidents rather than systematic patterns. Wright approached her research with academic rigor and professional skepticism that made her dangerous in ways that law enforcement investigations had not been. The family convened that evening to assess their options. 3 generations of Sinclairs gathered around their kitchen table to discuss problems that their ancestors had never faced. How do you maintain operational security when information travels at digital speeds? How do you discredit an investigator without creating more attention? How do you preserve family traditions when the outside world refuses to respect the boundaries that geography once provided? Cyrus favored direct action. She's asking the wrong people the wrong questions. Maybe she needs to learn that some mountains don't welcome visitors who can't mind their own business. Flora disagreed. Killing a journalist brings federal attention, FBI, state police, media coverage. We'd trade one problem for 10 bigger ones. Susan understood that Wright represented an evolutionary challenge that required evolutionary adaptation. The family had survived by being smarter than their threats, not more violent. They needed to neutralize Wright's investigation without creating martyrs or evidence that could be traced back to Hollingsworth Hollow. We invite her here, Susan decided. Give her what she's looking for: mountain hospitality, family stories, traditional recipes. Make her feel like she's discovered something special instead of something dangerous. The invitation would be extended through carefully orchestrated channels that made Wright feel like she'd earned access to an exclusive story rather than walked into a trap. Mountain families were notoriously private, so Wright would interpret cooperation as a professional breakthrough rather than a hunting strategy. FBI surveillance logs from December 9, 1997, recorded Wright's phone conversation with a contact who claimed to represent the Sinclair family. They're willing to talk, but only if you come alone and agree to certain ground rules about what you can publish. They've been burned by reporters before. Wright accepted the invitation immediately, driven by the same curiosity that had led Phineas Webb into the Hollow 2 months earlier. She packed her recording equipment, research notes, and enough supplies for a 3-day stay, planning to document what she believed would be her most important story. But as Wright drove toward Hollingsworth Hollow on the morning of December 12th, she had no way of knowing that the Sinclairs had been perfecting their hospitality for generations, and that guests who stayed for dinner rarely lived to write about the experience. What would happen when a family that had fed on secrets finally invited someone whose job was exposing the truth? Philomena Wright's car engine coughed to silence at 4:37 p.m. on December 12, 1997. The sudden quiet, broken only by the creak of settling metal and her own breathing, as she realized that the driveway she'd followed had somehow vanished behind her. The smell of wood smoke drifted down from the ridge above, mixed with something rich and savory that made her stomach growl, despite the knot of unease growing in her chest, while frost-covered leaves crunched beneath her boots with the brittle sound of promises about to break. Wright had no way of knowing that she just crossed an invisible threshold into hunting territory, where the rules of civilization dissolved like sugar in mountain rain. and where her professional instincts would prove less valuable than the survival skills she'd never needed to develop. The Sinclair homestead appeared exactly as Wright had imagined from her research, a sturdy log structure nestled against the mountainside, with smoke rising from a stone chimney and solar panels gleaming incongruously among hand-split shingles. Gardens terraced into the hillside showed the careful planning of people who understood that survival meant thinking years ahead. Everything spoke of self-sufficiency and deep connection to the land. Susan Spencer Sinclair emerged from the cabin before Wright finished gathering her equipment from the back seat. At 63, Susan moved with the easy confidence of someone completely comfortable in her environment, her graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and her clothes chosen for function rather than fashion. Her smile carried the warmth that had drawn visitors into these mountains for generations. "Miss Wright, welcome to our home," Susan called out, her voice carrying the musical cadences of mountain speech. "I hope the drive wasn't too difficult. These roads can be tricky for folks not used to mountain driving." Wright felt her anxiety ease as Susan approached. Whatever dark theories she'd constructed during her research seemed ridiculous in the face of such genuine hospitality. The woman greeting her looked like every idealized image of mountain grandmothers. Weathered hands that spoke of hard work, eyes that crinkled with laugh lines, and the kind of practical wisdom that came from generations of making do with less. "Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with me," Wright replied, pulling her recording equipment and notebooks from the car. "I know mountain families value their privacy. I really appreciate you making an exception." Susan's smile never wavered, but her eyes cataloged every piece of equipment Wright carried, every notebook and camera and electronic device that could potentially document whatever happened next. The family had discussed how to handle Wright's technology, reaching consensus that destroying evidence after the fact was preferable to preventing its creation in ways that might raise suspicions. "Privacy's important up here," Susan agreed, gesturing toward the cabin. "But so is hospitality. Mountain people have always shared what we have with travelers who need help. Come inside and get warm. Flora's got stew simmering, and there's fresh cornbread in the oven." Wright followed Susan up stone steps, worn smooth by decades of use, her journalist's eye cataloging details that would add authenticity to her story. Hand-forged iron hinges on the heavy wooden door, windows with actual wooden shutters that could be closed against mountain storms, a covered porch lined with rockers where families had gathered for evening conversations since before electric lights reached these hollers. Inside, the cabin exceeded Wright's expectations. Despite its rustic exterior, the interior showed modern conveniences integrated seamlessly with traditional mountain craftsmanship. Solar power supplied electricity for refrigeration and lighting. A wood-burning stove provided heat and cooking capability. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books that ranged from practical manuals on farming and food preservation to classic literature and modern technical texts. The smell never goes away. Flora Cromwell Sinclair appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron that showed the stains of serious cooking. At 41, she possessed the kind of competent beauty that mountain life produced in women who understood that survival trumped vanity. Her dark hair was streaked with premature gray, and her hands moved with the economical precision of someone who wasted neither motion nor materials. "You must be starving after that drive," Flora said, her voice softer than Susan's but carrying the same note of genuine concern. "I've got venison stew with vegetables from our garden, and cornbread made from corn we grow and grind ourselves. Everything on the table comes from this mountain." Wright accepted the invitation gratefully, recognizing an opportunity to document authentic mountain foodways for her article. She set up her recording equipment on the kitchen table, testing levels and adjusting settings, while the women bustled around her with the comfortable efficiency of people who'd shared kitchen duties for decades. The stew smelled incredible, rich, complex, seasoned with herbs that Wright couldn't identify, but that created flavors she'd never experienced. The meat was impossibly tender, falling apart at the touch of her spoon, and the vegetables had absorbed flavors that seemed to capture the essence of the mountain soil where they'd grown. "This is amazing," Wright said between spoonfuls, her compliment entirely genuine. "I've never tasted venison prepared this way. What's your secret?" Susan and Flora exchanged a glance that lasted perhaps half a second, but Wright caught it. Her journalist's instincts, dulled by warmth and exceptional food, sharpened slightly. There was something in that look not unfriendly, but careful, calculating. "Old family recipes," Susan replied with the same warm smile, "passed down through generations. The key is understanding your ingredients, knowing exactly what you're working with." But as Wright savored another spoonful of the stew, she began to notice flavors that seemed almost familiar, as if she'd tasted something similar before, but couldn't quite place the memory. What was it about this meat that made her think of something she'd rather not remember? The basement door clicked shut behind Philomena Wright at 8:42 p.m., with the soft finality of a coffin lid closing, followed by the scrape of metal against wood as something heavy slid across the floor above her head. The smell hit her first, not the clean scent of a root cellar she'd expected, but something organic and cloying that made her gag, while her fingers found walls lined with what felt like butcher paper, but moved under her touch like skin stretched too tight. Wright's investigation had led her exactly where the Sinclair family wanted her to go, but now she understood that some stories were never meant to be told by the people who discovered them. "Just need to get some preserved peaches from the cellar," Flora had said 20 minutes earlier, her smile as warm as ever. "You'll love them with the cornbread. Susan, why don't you show Miss Wright the family photographs while I fetch dessert?" The photographs told their own story. 4 generations of Sinclairs stared out from frames arranged on the mantelpiece, their expressions sharing a common thread of quiet satisfaction. But Wright's trained eye caught details that made her stomach tighten. Too many family portraits included people who didn't appear in subsequent photos, faces that belonged to no family tree she could trace. One photograph from 1943 showed the extended Sinclair clan gathered around their dinner table. Wright counted 14 people, but her research indicated that only 6 family members lived on the homestead during that period. The extra faces belonged to strangers, travelers perhaps, who joined the family for what appeared to be a celebration. "That was taken during the war," Susan explained, following Wright's gaze. "We always opened our table to folks passing through. Mountain hospitality, you understand. Some of those people stayed with us for weeks." But Wright noticed something else about the photograph. The expressions on the strangers' faces showed a glassy contentment that didn't match the sharp awareness in the Sinclair's eyes, as if some of the people around that table weren't entirely conscious of what was happening. Flora had returned from the kitchen carrying a tray of what she claimed were peach preserves, but the fruit's color was wrong, too dark, too rich, more like meat than anything that had ever grown on trees. When Wright politely declined dessert, claiming she was too full from the excellent stew, Flora's smile had shifted almost imperceptibly. "You should at least see where we do our preserving," Flora had suggested. "Most city folks don't understand how much work goes into mountain self-sufficiency. The root cellars where we keep everything that gets us through winter." The memory dissolved. Wright found herself alone in complete darkness, her phone's flashlight revealing stone walls lined with shelves that held jars filled with things that definitely weren't vegetables. Some containers held what looked like organs suspended in clear liquid. Others contained strips of meat that had been carefully labeled with dates and what appeared to be personal descriptions. L. C. November 97, excellent marbling, and P.W. October 97, lean but flavorful. Her hand shaking, Wright photographed everything her phone's light revealed. The jars, the labels, the meat hooks suspended from the ceiling, the drain in the center of the floor that suggested this space had been designed for processing large quantities of something that bled. A ledger sat open on a wooden table, its pages filled with the same careful handwriting she'd seen on the preserve labels. Names, dates, weights, and notes about flavor profiles filled page after page, going back decades. Wright recognized some of the names from her missing persons research: Lucius Carrington, Phineas Webb, and dozens of others who'd vanished in these mountains. The truth lives in the details. Wright's training kicked in despite her terror. She documented everything methodically, knowing that evidence meant nothing if she couldn't survive to present it. Her camera flash revealed more than she wanted to see: a workstation equipped with knives arranged in precise order, bins for different types of waste, and a pulley system that could lift heavy loads to the ceiling hooks. This wasn't improvised violence. This was systematic processing that had been refined through generations of practice. Above her head, footsteps moved with purpose rather than panic. The Sinclairs weren't rushing to contain a crisis. They were following procedures they'd rehearsed many times before. Wright heard Susan's voice through the floorboards, calm and conversational. "Should be ready by morning. Flora's got everything prepared." Wright tested the door she'd entered through, finding it locked from the outside. She searched the cellar for other exits, her phone's light revealing no windows, no alternate stairways, no escape routes that hadn't been deliberately eliminated. The Sinclairs had learned from experience that preservation required controlling every variable, including the possibility that their guests might change their minds about staying for dinner. Her phone showed no signal, but Wright realized that might not matter. She'd told her editor she was visiting the Sinclairs, left detailed notes about her research, and scheduled a check-in call for tomorrow morning. If she disappeared, people would know where to look. But as Wright heard the family moving around upstairs with the unhurried efficiency of people following a familiar routine, she began to understand that the Sinclairs had been making people disappear for so long that they'd learned how to handle investigations, journalists, and anyone else who asked inconvenient questions. How many other reporters had sat in that same kitchen, complimenting the stew, before learning what they'd actually been eating? The floorboards above Philomena Wright's head groaned at 11:53 p.m. as something heavy dragged across them, followed by the metallic scrape of knives being sharpened and the wet slap of plastic sheeting being unfolded. The smell of bleach drifted down through gaps in the ceiling, mixing with the organic decay that permeated the cellar, while Wright's fingers traced along stone walls that felt damp with more than condensation, searching desperately for any weakness in the Sinclairs' perfectly planned prison. Wright's survival now depended on understanding that the family's century of experience had taught them to prepare for every contingency except one: a victim who refused to accept that escape was impossible. Her phone's battery showed 18% remaining, but Wright realized that preserving power mattered less than documenting everything she'd discovered. If she didn't survive, at least the evidence might. She recorded a video message explaining her location, her research findings, and the contents of the cellar, uploading it to cloud storage despite having no signal bars. The upload failed immediately, but her phone would automatically retry when it detected connectivity. Technology might accomplish what courage couldn't. The Sinclairs' voices carried clearly through the old floorboards, their conversation revealing the practiced efficiency of people who'd handled similar situations many times before. Wright heard Susan directing the preparation. "Flora, make sure the plastic covers the whole table this time. Last month's mess took hours to clean properly." "Already done," Flora replied. "Cyrus is bringing the tools down from the barn. Should we wait until she's unconscious, or does it matter?" Susan's answer chilled Wright's blood. "Conscious is better. Fear releases hormones that affect the taste, but awareness keeps the heart pumping longer. More efficient drainage." Wright forced herself to focus on problem solving rather than panic. The cellar showed signs of recent construction improvements: concrete reinforcement around the original stone foundation, modern drainage systems, and electrical outlets that powered refrigeration units. But old structures always had weak points that newer additions couldn't completely eliminate. She found what she was looking for behind a shelf of preserved organs. A section of original stone wall where mortar had crumbled over decades of freeze-thaw cycles. Working quietly, Wright used her car keys to scrape away loose mortar around one particular stone that shifted slightly when she pushed against it. Above her, the family's preparations continued, with the methodical patience of people who understood that rushing led to mistakes. Wright heard them discussing her equipment. The recording stuff goes in the fire. The car gets driven to the overlook and pushed off. Make it look like she missed the curve coming down the mountain. What about the editor she mentioned? Cyrus asked. Mountain roads are dangerous, Susan replied matter-of-factly. City folks don't understand how easy it is to have an accident up here, especially in winter weather. Wright's key finally worked the stone loose enough to pull free, creating a hole just large enough for her to squeeze through. Behind the stone lay not freedom, but another chamber, this one natural rather than constructed. Cave systems honeycombed these mountains, and Wright realized she'd found an entrance to passages that might connect to the outside world. The cave stretched beyond her phone's light, but Wright heard something that made her heart race. The distant sound of moving water. Underground streams in this region often surfaced miles away from their origins. If she could follow the water, she might find an exit that the Sinclairs didn't know about or couldn't control. But caves also meant getting lost in absolute darkness, hypothermia, and dying alone in ways that would leave no evidence of what she'd discovered. Wright made her choice. She squeezed through the hole, scraping skin against rough stone, and found herself in a passage barely wide enough for her shoulders. Her phone's light revealed flowstone formations and mineral deposits that indicated water had carved these tunnels over thousands of years. The sound of flowing water grew stronger as she crawled forward, following passages that angled downward through the mountain's core. The hunger follows every trail. Behind her, Wright heard the cellar door open and Susan's voice calling out, "Miss Wright, time for dessert." The tone remained perfectly pleasant, as if she were summoning a guest to the dinner table rather than discovering an empty prison. The politeness lasted exactly 3 seconds. "She's gone," Cyrus said, his voice sharp with the first emotion Wright had heard from any family member. How the hell did she get out of a locked cellar? Wright crawled faster, her phone's light bouncing wildly as she navigated passages that seemed designed by geological forces rather than human planning. The cave system was a maze, but water always flowed downhill toward larger streams, and larger streams eventually reached rivers that connected to the outside world. Her phone showed 2% battery when she finally heard something that made her sob with relief, the sound of vehicles on a distant road. Wright had found a cave entrance that opened onto the valley highway, hidden behind undergrowth that concealed it from casual observation, but couldn't muffle the sound of late-night traffic. She emerged into freezing December air at 2:47 a.m., covered in cave mud and bleeding from dozens of scrapes, but alive and carrying evidence that could destroy the Sinclair family's operation forever. Wright flagged down the first vehicle she saw, a delivery truck heading toward the interstate, and convinced the driver to call police from the nearest town. But when state police and FBI agents arrived at the Sinclair homestead 6 hours later, they found only an empty cabin and a cold fire pit. The family had vanished as completely as their victims, taking their tools, their records, and their knowledge of where the other bodies were buried. Wright's evidence from the cellar led to the discovery of remains belonging to 43 missing persons spanning 50 years. But the Sinclairs themselves had dissolved into the mountains like morning fog, carrying their traditions to new hunting grounds where strangers still disappeared, and local families learned not to ask uncomfortable questions. To this day, hikers in remote Appalachian regions report encounters with helpful local families who offer directions, weather advice, and invitations to share meals that taste better than anything they've ever experienced. What would you do if the people trying to help you seemed just a little too eager to make sure you stayed for dinner? The FBI evidence van pulled away from Hollingsworth Hollow at sunset on December 20th, 1997, its tires crunching over gravel that would never again sound innocent to anyone who understood what lay buried beneath these mountains. Special Agent Nellie Hathaway watched the hollow disappear in her rearview mirror, knowing that 43 families would finally have answers about their missing loved ones, but that the questions raised by those answers would haunt investigators for decades to come. This case didn't end with arrests or convictions. It revealed how easily entire communities could become complicit in horrors that operated just beyond the boundaries of what civilization was willing to acknowledge. The forensic excavation of the Sinclair property required 6 weeks and revealed processing capabilities that exceeded anything investigators had encountered in domestic cases. The family's operation showed sophistication that suggested not just generations of practice, but systematic refinement of techniques that maximized efficiency while minimizing evidence. Remains were found in multiple locations across their property, some buried in traditional graves, others processed and stored in ways that suggested the Sinclairs understood food preservation better than most commercial operations. Dr. Maud Vanderbilt, the forensic anthropologist who led the examination, described the discovery in clinical terms that couldn't mask her horror. This family had developed methods for processing human remains that showed knowledge of anatomy, chemistry, and preservation techniques that took decades to perfect. They weren't just killing people, they were farming them. The investigation revealed that the Sinclair's operation extended beyond simple predation into something approaching agricultural sustainability. They selected victims based on specific criteria: health, age, diet, and lifestyle factors that affected meat quality. They studied their targets for weeks before making contact, learning habits and preferences that allowed them to provide exactly the kind of hospitality that made guests feel comfortable and grateful. But the most disturbing discovery came from analyzing the family's extensive record keeping. The Sinclairs had documented not just their victims, but their customers. Mountain families throughout the region had been purchasing what they believed was venison, wild boar, and other game meat from the Sinclairs for generations. Analysis of the sales records suggested that dozens of families had unknowingly participated in cannibalism, buying processed human meat that was marketed as ethically sourced wild game. The hunger spreads through commerce. Federal prosecutors faced an unprecedented challenge. How do you prosecute an entire community for unknowing cannibalism? How do you charge people with crimes they committed while believing they were supporting local agriculture? The legal questions became moot when DNA testing revealed that many of the customers were themselves related to the Sinclairs through marriages and informal adoptions that had occurred over multiple generations. The family's disappearance triggered a manhunt that stretched across 3 states and involved multiple federal agencies. But the Sinclairs had advantages that most fugitives lacked: intimate knowledge of wilderness areas, extensive networks of mountain families who valued privacy above law enforcement cooperation, and survival skills developed through generations of living off the grid. Sightings came sporadically over the following years. Hikers reported encounters with helpful families who offered directions and emergency assistance in remote areas of Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia. Some of these encounters matched descriptions of the Sinclairs, but by the time investigators reached the reported locations, they found only abandoned campsites and cold fire pits. The pattern was always the same: families moving through wilderness areas, avoiding population centers, and making contact only with isolated travelers who were unlikely to be missed immediately. The Sinclairs had learned from their mistakes in Hollingsworth Hollow, adapting their methods for a mobile lifestyle that left fewer traces and created less concentrated evidence. Philomena Wright's survival and testimony led to her receiving the Investigative Reporters and Editors Award for Public Service in 1998. But the recognition came with costs that no journalist should have to pay. She required years of therapy to process what she'd experienced, and she never returned to investigative work involving missing persons cases. Her article about the Sinclairs, published in Harper's Magazine, became one of the most read pieces in the publication's history, but Wright herself disappeared from public life shortly after its publication. Some stories consumed their tellers. The Hollingsworth Hollow case fundamentally changed how law enforcement agencies approached missing persons investigations in rural areas. The FBI established protocols for recognizing patterns that suggested systematic rather than random disappearances. State police agencies began coordinating more effectively across jurisdictional boundaries. But these improvements came too late for the 43 victims whose remains were found, and too late for others who might still be missing in cases that never achieved the visibility of Wright's investigation. The hollow itself remains abandoned, posted with federal warning signs, and patrolled periodically by park rangers who report nothing unusual except the complete absence of wildlife in an area that should be teeming with deer, rabbits, and other game animals. Local hunters avoid the area not because of official restrictions, but because their dogs refuse to track scents that lead toward the old Sinclair property. Modern technology has made the Sinclair's traditional methods more difficult, but not impossible. GPS tracking, cell phone towers, and social media create digital trails that can be followed by investigators, but they also provide information that sophisticated predators can use to select victims who are least likely to be missed. Missing persons reports filed in rural areas of Appalachia continue to show statistical anomalies that suggest systematic causes, but proving those patterns requires resources that most agencies can't dedicate to cases involving drifters, runaways, and people who choose isolation as a lifestyle. The hunger adapts faster than the law. Wright's investigation answered questions about specific disappearances, but it raised larger concerns about how many other mountain families might have developed similar survival strategies. Anthropologists studying Appalachian culture note that extreme isolation, combined with the historical necessity of self-sufficiency, could have produced multiple instances of families crossing moral boundaries that urbanized society considers absolute. How many other hollers contain families who learned to see strangers not as people to help, but as resources to harvest? How many missing persons cases attributed to accidents or animal attacks actually represent systematic predation by families who've been perfecting their methods for generations? And how many well-meaning neighbors continue to purchase wild game from sources they trust without asking questions about hunting licenses, processing locations, or why the meat tastes unlike anything they've ever experienced? These questions remain unanswered because the investigation ended with the Sinclairs' disappearance, not their capture. Somewhere in the vast wilderness of Appalachian mountains, a family continues to practice traditions that predate civilization's moral constraints, adapting ancient survival strategies to modern opportunities. What would you do if you met a helpful mountain family whose hospitality seemed too good to be true, whose meat tasted too perfect, and whose smiles held secrets that might explain why so many hikers never make it home from their wilderness adventures? Even now, park rangers in remote areas of Kentucky report finding abandoned campsites with unusual characteristics, fire pits arranged for maximum heat efficiency, makeshift smokehouses constructed with professional precision, and tool marks on trees that suggest someone with extensive butchering experience had been sharpening knives against the bark. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.